The plane touched down just after sunset, and the city lights flickered like dying embers through the window. I had been gone for a week of tense meetings, sleepless nights, and the kind of fake smiles that make your jaw ache. All I wanted was home. I pictured my grandfather's old flannel shirt, the smell of his tea steeping too long, and the quiet warmth that always made the house feel like a refuge from the noise of the world. When the taxi stopped at the gate, I noticed something strange. The front porch light was off. A first. Grandpa never forgot to turn it on for me. It was his way of saying, "Welcome back, kid." The gate latch was stiff, as if it hadn't been moved in days. I frowned, feeling a quiet unease crawl up my spine. The house was dark except for a faint glow in the kitchen window, maybe from the streetlight reflecting off something metallic. Inside, the silence was heavy. The air was thick, stale. Not the faint smell of cinnamon and polish I was used to. My suitcase thudded softly against the floor as I set it down. "Grandpa," I called. No answer. "Mom? Dad?" Still nothing. I tried to convince myself they'd gone out, but my chest tightened when I noticed Grandpa's cane leaning against the wall by the door. He never went anywhere without it. Then I heard it. A faint, uneven noise. Clang. Pause. Clang. Like metal scraping metal, muffled but persistent. It was coming from the garage. My pulse quickened as I followed the sound. "Grandpa," I whispered again, louder this time. The doorknob to the garage was locked. Odd. We never locked it. I found the spare key on the kitchen hook and turned it with trembling hands. The door creaked open, and the smell hit me first, sour, heavy air, tinged with oil, rust, and something else, something human. My breath caught as I flicked on the light. He was there. My grandfather. Slumped against the workbench like a discarded doll. His face pale, skin clammy, hands trembling in his lap. His clothes were dirty and torn, his lips cracked. For a second I thought I was too late. "Grandpa." I dropped to my knees beside him. He stirred weakly, his eyes fluttering open. When they focused on me, tears welled up instantly. "Kid." His voice was barely a whisper. "You came back." I grabbed the old blanket from a nearby chair and wrapped it around him, trying to steady his shaking. "What happened? Who did this to you?" I asked, fighting the panic in my throat. He hesitated, his lips trembling. Then with a weak, bitter breath, he said words that turned my world inside out. "Your dad. He wanted to teach me a lesson." For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. My father. The man who'd always claimed to respect his elders. The man who'd lectured me about family duty and discipline. The room spun. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice cracking. Grandpa's eyes filled with pain. He got angry, said I was meddling, said I talked too much about how he runs things. Locked me in here. 3 days. His breathing hitched. No food, no water. Just wanted me to think about who's in charge. I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was mistaken, but deep down I knew. I had seen flashes of my father's temper, the way he could twist control into cruelty, the way people fell silent when he entered a room. My throat burned with disbelief, rage, and shame. "Don't move," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll get you help." I called an ambulance, my hands shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. As I waited, I looked around the garage, the overturned chair, the empty water bottle, the padlock lying on the floor, scratched and broken. My father's cruelty was everywhere, etched into the cold concrete. When the paramedics arrived, they took Grandpa away gently. I followed them in silence, numb but seething. Every bump of the road rattled through me like the pulse of anger in my veins. I didn't know how, not yet, but one thing was certain. My father had taught the wrong man a lesson that night. And soon I would teach him mine. The hospital smelled of disinfectant and muted suffering. Machines hummed softly as my grandfather lay hooked to 4 lines, his chest rising and falling with fragile steadiness. The doctor said he was dehydrated, malnourished, and traumatized, but he'd recover physically. Emotionally, that was harder to measure. He kept waking up in confusion, muttering apologies as if the ordeal had somehow been his fault. Every time I tried to reassure him, his eyes clouded with fear, fear of my father. My father didn't visit the hospital. Neither did my mother. Instead, she called me that night, her voice trembling with forced calm. "You're making too much of this, honey," she said, as though I had caught Grandpa sneaking a cookie before dinner, not surviving 3 days of imprisonment. Your father and I had a misunderstanding with him. He's old. He exaggerates. The words made me clench the phone until my knuckles whitened. A misunderstanding? I hissed. He locked him in a garage. There was silence, then a whisper that barely sounded like her. Don't make this harder than it already is. And just like that, she hung up. I sat there, staring at the blank screen of my phone, the hum of the fluorescent lights blending into a roar of disbelief. A misunderstanding. I wanted to storm to their house, demand answers, drag my father into the garage he'd used as a prison. But I forced myself to stop. Anger was what he thrived on, it was how he won. No, this time I needed something sharper. Quieter. Calculated. Over the next few days, I began piecing the truth together, one thread at a time. I started with the neighbor, Mrs. Harlow, a sweet woman with a sharp memory and a habit of keeping her curtains half open. She looked startled when I knocked on her door, but when I mentioned Grandpa, her eyes softened with guilt. I thought something was wrong, she confessed, twisting her hands. I heard shouting that night. Then the next day I saw your father buying locks and chains from the hardware store. I thought maybe it was for the shed. She hesitated. I should have checked. I'm so sorry. That was the first piece of proof. Then came the mechanic at the local shop, who remembered Dad's temper all too well. He came in looking furious, the man told me. Said his father-in-law was meddling with his business accounts. Bought industrial padlocks. I didn't ask questions. Should have known better. I wrote everything down in a notebook, times, witnesses, small inconsistencies. The more I dug, the clearer it became. My father had been spiraling for a while. Grandpa had hinted before that Dad was borrowing from the family business and using intimidation to keep people silent. It wasn't just cruelty. It was control. One night, Grandpa woke suddenly, his voice rasping. He said I was weak, he whispered. Said I shouldn't question how he runs things. When I told him honesty mattered, he lost it. Locked me up to prove he could. I held his hand, fighting tears. He'll never hurt you again, I promised. But I knew promises meant little without proof. So I started digging deeper. Phone records, emails, even old financial files Grandpa had hidden away in a chest at home. I discovered payments to consultants, who didn't exist, donations made in Dad's name but never received by the charities listed. It was a trail of deceit disguised as success. Every discovery hardened me further. I didn't want revenge born of rage. I wanted justice shaped by precision. My father had built his reputation on being a pillar of the community. I would make that pillar crumble piece by piece under the weight of truth. Still, I couldn't shake the ache in my chest. Every new fact about his corruption wasn't just evidence. It was a memory stained. I remembered him teaching me to tie my shoes, praising me at my graduation, pretending to be proud. All of it now felt like theater performed by a man who believed love was just another tool of manipulation. As Grandpa slowly regained strength, I began planning in silence. I would gather enough to expose my father publicly, not just to punish him, but to protect everyone he had power over. I looked at Grandpa, frail but smiling faintly at the sight of morning light through his hospital window, and I felt something shift inside me. My father had used cruelty to teach lessons. I would use truth to destroy his lies. And when I was done, the world would see him exactly as I did, small, hollow, and utterly powerless. By the time Grandpa left the hospital, the plan had a rhythm. Find witnesses, gather documents, and present a case so obvious it couldn't be waved away with a practiced smile. I learned quickly that my father's kingdom had many small doors, and that most of them opened to rooms full of people who'd been waiting quietly for someone brave enough to ask questions. The first public crack came at the country club. My father adored the club like a man adores an altar. It was where prestige bloomed and reputations were polished. I arranged to speak with a board member I'd met at a charity auction months earlier, an older woman who'd always seemed too honest for my father's tastes. I slid a slim packet across her mahogany desk. Copies of invoices, bank transfers, and a careful timeline connecting donor money that never reached the named charities to companies that existed only on paper. She read in a silence that felt like the calm before a storm. If this is true, she said finally, we need an audit. Audits move like glaciers, slow, inevitable, and lethal to fragile things beneath them. Once the board asked questions, the paper trail began to do the work I couldn't. Numbers don't flatter or charm. They either add up or they don't. Small contractors who had shrugged off my father's bark found courage in the idea that someone else knew. One by one they offered statements. A priest who'd long accepted my father's generosity asked a few probing questions and discovered discrepancies. At a modest parish council meeting, a man who'd once signed receipts under duress stood and told the room how he'd been bullied into silence. The murmur spread like wind in dry grass. My father noticed, of course. Men built on fear feel the breeze before the storm. He tried to push back with his usual tools: charisma, generosity, threats thinly veiled as concern. He called a family meeting with a performance that borrowed from sincerity. He offered to make amends. He asked for time for silence. I let him speak. Silence, I had come to understand, is not always consent, sometimes it is strategy. He escalated in ways I hadn't expected. He tried to buy loyalty, small checks to old friends, offers to pay off contractors who were now talking. He threatened those who refused, a quiet warning delivered over terse dinners. Once, in a senior center parking lot, he cornered one of the men who'd agreed to speak with me and said, "You're making a mistake. Think about your family." The man's hands trembled when he told me, but he kept his statement. That's when I shifted from gathering to protecting. I helped witnesses get legal counsel. I organized copies of documents and made sure they were stored in multiple places, paper, scanned, and in the hands of people who couldn't be bought. I arranged for a local attorney to review the irregular transfers and confirm they were, at minimum, suspicious and at most criminal. The attorney's professional letterhead, dry, formal, and personal, did more damage than the most passionate speech ever could. The social fallout came next. Invitations stopped arriving for my father. Phone calls went unanswered. People who had once deferred to him now asked polite, careful questions. The man who had always shaped other people's stories found his silences returned to him in kind. He railed at the unfairness. He sputtered about persecution, but the language that had once intimidated now sounded shrill. He also tried to anger me directly. He sent a string of messages meant to wound. Accusations about my loyalty, about betraying the family, about destroying his life. He stormed into my house one afternoon and banged his fist on the kitchen counter. A gust of old authority that had once flattened my breath. I met him not with great roars but with paper. A certified letter demanding he explain the transfers, a notice that contractors were willing to press charges, and quietly, a petition for a protective order to keep him away from Grandpa while the inquiries continued. The protective order felt like a hinge swinging shut on a long rotten door. For the first time there was a legal boundary between my father and the man he'd abused. It didn't humiliate him in front of the world with the flash of a scandal. Instead, it rendered his daily control impotent. He could rattle his keys in the driveway, but he could not cross the threshold. There were nights I lay awake imagining all the ways this could go wrong: counterclaims, slander, the slow drip of family relationships corroding. My mother retreated into a silence that felt like grief. My brother wavered between allegiance and shame. It hurt. I did not celebrate the pain of my family. I mourned the cost. But every time Grandpa smiled across the table while eating something solid again, my resolve hardened. The campaign of exposure had been surgical rather than vindictive. The goal was never to humiliate for pleasure. It was to show a man's true face and ensure he no longer had the power to make terror of people's lives. With the club audit underway, contractors prepared affidavits, and the parish quietly reassessed its accounts, my father's scaffolding began to creak. The next moves would be bigger, public, and final. I had taken away his audience. Now I would make sure the record reflected what had happened behind closed doors. The reckoning was taking shape, and the man who had taught me to swallow pain would soon find himself unable to teach anyone anything at all. By the time winter rolled around, my father's name had become a whisper, the kind that people exchanged cautiously, like handling something sharp. The board's audit was nearly complete. The contractor's statements were verified, and local news outlets had begun to sniff around. I hadn't spoken to him in months, yet he lingered in everything. His absence was loud, like a ghost haunting his own reputation. When the official report arrived, it was devastating. Misappropriation of funds, coercion, elder abuse. Every sin he'd hidden behind polished smiles and charitable donations was now documented in sterile paragraphs and stamped with legal authority. The country club revoked his membership. The parish froze his access to financial decisions. The empire he'd built on control and intimidation was dissolving faster than even I imagined. I didn't gloat. Not once. I just sat in silence, the report heavy in my hands, while Grandpa watched me from his armchair. His voice was soft, trembling but proud. "You did it, kid," he said. "You gave him the lesson he never thought he'd learn." I smiled faintly. He taught people to fear silence. I just turned it against him. The day the hearing was scheduled, rain fell in steady gray sheets. My father walked into the courthouse looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. No polished smile, no booming voice. Just a man stripped of certainty. My mother sat behind him, pale and shaking, clutching a tissue she never used. I sat beside Grandpa, my hand on his, steadying him as much as he steadied me. When my father's eyes met mine, something flickered. Anger, regret, maybe both. But there was no apology. The judge read the charges. Elder abuse, falsified financial records, misuse of donations, intimidation. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. My father tried to defend himself, spinning stories about misunderstandings, about how he was only protecting the family business. His voice cracked, arrogance melting into desperation. When Grandpa took the stand, the room went silent. He didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He simply spoke, steady, truthful, dignified. "My son forgot that respect isn't something you can force," he said. "He locked me in a garage because he wanted to remind me who was in charge. But real strength isn't control. It's kindness." His words hung in the air like a prayer for every person my father had ever belittled. The verdict wasn't dramatic. The court ruled in Grandpa's favor. Full restraining order, financial restitution, and a formal investigation into my father's misdeeds. There was no prison sentence yet, but the weight of his disgrace was heavier than any cell. His colleagues turned their backs. His friends stopped returning calls. The world he dominated now saw him as what he truly was. A coward cloaked in power. Weeks passed and our lives began to mend. The house no longer felt haunted. Grandpa returned to his workshop, not to repair things for others but for himself. He built birdhouses, small and colorful, hanging them along the backyard fence like markers of freedom. I often watched him from the porch, feeling a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. Then one evening my phone buzzed. A text from my father. "You've ruined everything. Are you happy?" I stared at it for a long time, then typed back just 3 words. "I found peace." And I meant it. He didn't reply. That night, Grandpa and I shared tea in the warm glow of the kitchen. He chuckled softly. "You didn't destroy him," he said. "You just made him face himself." I nodded. That was always the plan. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the world smelled clean again, washed of the lies, the cruelty, the noise. For the first time, the house felt safe. Grandpa leaned back, eyes closing, the faintest smile on his lips. "Your dad wanted to teach me a lesson," he murmured. "But I think you taught the right one." I looked at him, the man who had endured so much and still found it in his heart to forgive, and realized that revenge had transformed into something purer, justice wrapped in mercy. The darkness that had once filled our home had lifted.